You know, U.S. businesses with links to China are keeping a nervous eye on the uprising. Economic ties between the two nations are extensive, ranging from tourism to coal mining. CNN's Taylor Henry reports.
Ever since the unrest in China reached a fever pitch last week, U.S. travel agencies have been swamped with phone calls.
Asian Dreams, good morning. This is Susan. May I help you?
Callers with Chinese vacation plans are asking if they should call them off. That could prove devastating to China's $2.2 billion a year tourist industry.
We would get many cancellations if the demonstrations did become violent.
450 U.S. corporations with interests in China are paying even closer attention.
There is always cause for concern in business when the environment in which you're operating changes in any dramatic way. This is dramatic.
We believe that, yes, our embassy has been in contact with American businesses there in China to keep them appraised of the situation.
Some firms, like the Bechtel Corporation, have evacuated personnel from Beijing to Hong Kong until things settle down. And some U.S. executives have delayed business trips to China.
They're going to wait. They're going to wait to see what the shakeout is of this thing. Are the rules going to change as a result of the political changes that are ongoing right now?
Business at Kentucky Fried Chicken in Tiananmen Square is down 50% because roadblocks have held up shipments of chicken. The turmoil has caused erratic fluctuations on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, where business is closely tied to mainland China. At stake are more than 600 U.S.-Chinese joint ventures in China. Aircraft assembly, coal mining, and nuclear power plant construction, to name a few, all begun since the countries normalized relations a decade ago.
The State Department has issued an advisory that recommends deferring travel until May 27th. Now, they have imposed martial law, but from what we understand is that the troops are not moving. Knowing that, and that the State Department is advising that, they may want to go ahead and cancel.
But travel agents say most U.S. tourists are taking a wait-and-see attitude. American business experts, meanwhile, expect any changes in the business climate will be favorable, not harmful to U.S. interests, because the students leading the revolt are reform-minded, pushing for even greater democracy in the People's Republic. Taylor Henry, CNN, Los Angeles.
Coming up on this edition of CNN's Evening News, an afternoon outing on a river goes wrong and...
Hear themselves described as counter-revolutionaries by a state radio broadcast. It's a charge tantamount to treason in China, and there are rumors fresh army troops loyal to Li Peng are heading towards Beijing. All of today's events are fueling widespread speculation that hardliners are gaining the upper hand in a fateful power struggle in the Chinese government. You know, in China, where things are not always what they seem and important events always seem to take place behind closed doors, reading between the lines is an art form. That's why even English language lessons on state-run TV are being scrutinized for clues to the fate of China's top leaders. Monster, dinosaur, extinct were the new vocabulary words for today. What does it all mean? Phones jangled all over Beijing as nervous Chinese tried to find out. To some, it spelled trouble for Li Peng and 84-year-old...
Brian Jenkins is standing by now in Beijing, where earlier today, more than 100,000 workers and intellectuals marched with the students demanding Li's ouster. Brian?
Ralph, it's now 4 a.m. in Beijing, and the new rumors are popping up every hour on Tiananmen Square in the heart of the city, where student protesters are camped out for a 14th night. One rumor was that the Army would move in at 3 a.m. to clear the students off the square. That hasn't happened yet, of course. A few minutes ago, student leaders announced over the public address system they set up on the square that China's senior leader, Deng Xiaoping, is dead. There is absolutely no confirmation of that, and it's probably just wishful thinking on the part of the students, because it's becoming clear that Deng has affirmed his hold on power. He is the chairman of the Central Military Commission and has reportedly been flying around China this week, talking to military commanders and getting their assurances of support in carrying out martial law in Beijing. Now, the man who issued the declaration of martial law last Saturday, Chinese Premier Li Peng, was shown, as you said, on state-run television 9 hours ago, meeting with foreign diplomats. It was his first public appearance since Saturday, and it indicated that Li had won the power struggle against Communist Party Secretary General Zhao Ziyang. Our sources told us 24 hours ago that Zhao is out, and Li has survived with the approval of Deng Xiaoping, the elder statesman. Now, students on the square in Tiananmen Square tell us that they do not believe that Li Peng will survive. They still believe that he will be forced out, as they have been asking for the past week. They say they are willing to stay on the square until their demands are met, and they believe they have the support of the people of Beijing. Again, they feel that the power struggle at the top levels of government has not been resolved, but all the indications say otherwise, as CNN Beijing Bureau Chief Mike Chenoy reports.
The political crisis triggered by the student protest campaign here appears to be nearing a climax. With increasing signs, the hardliners may be winning out. The clearest indication so far, an angrily worded attack on the students in Tiananmen Square from the leaders of the Chinese military, broadcast on Radio Beijing, describing the protesters as counter-revolutionaries and calling on all troops to follow the directives of Premier Li Peng. In the wake of persistent reports of dissension in the armed forces over how to handle the protests, the broadcast suggests a sizable element in the military leadership has now come over to the conservatives' camp. At the same time, the plane that carried Chinese Parliament Chairman Wan Li back from his state visit to the United States arrived in Beijing. But Wan was not on board. As his entourage deplaned, it emerged that Wan had gotten off in Shanghai. Analysts believe Wan is likely to wait in that city to see which way the political winds are blowing. This appears to dash, for now anyway, hopes that Wan might be able to play a mediating role in the crisis. Other signs include the decision to pull the plug on all satellite news transmissions from Beijing, an attempt to reimpose the news blackout originally announced last weekend. And still unconfirmed reports that the Communist Party has formed a special committee to handle propaganda work. Its chief task, to ensure that the Chinese media toes a new and more orthodox party line. These developments come amid persistent reports that Premier Li and elder statesman Deng Xiaoping are gaining the upper hand in their bitter power struggle with Liberal Communist Party chief Zhao Ziyang. That the hardliners now control the Communist Party apparatus, as well as most of the military and the propaganda machinery. But they do not control the people, and if they should move to reimpose their authority, there could well be trouble on the streets. Mike Chenoy, CNN, Beijing.
Now, in the wee hours in Beijing, there is only quiet on the streets. Far fewer people than we have seen out on the streets manning barricades and circling Tiananmen Square than we have seen in the past several nights. Students have enjoyed a rock concert, a brief rock concert this evening, and they are simply waiting to see what the government will do. Reporting live from Beijing, this is Brian Jenkins, sending you back to Gene Randall in Washington.
Thank you, Brian. A leftist Bolivian group today claimed responsibility for last night's
machine over reformers in the leadership power struggle. Sources tell CNN's Mike Chenoy that party leader Zhao Ziyang may be under house arrest. Mikhail Gorbachev was overwhelmingly voted in as president.
From the 1930s until today, Deng has worked side by side with the men who now run the Chinese armed forces. So it's no surprise that it was this old boy network which Deng called on to rescue him from the anger of the masses, an anger that came closer to forcing China's elder statesmen from office than anyone here thought possible. Deng's handling of the crisis reveals other characteristics of a man who, until recently, had been widely viewed abroad as an attractive and forward-looking leader. Those who've dealt with him say he is a person with a long political memory, that he forgets nothing and forgives nothing, that he was deeply wounded by the personal attacks on him made by the protesters, and even more upset when Communist Party Chief Zhao told Soviet leader Gorbachev and the rest of the world that Deng retained ultimate responsibility for government policies here. A statement Deng is said to have interpreted as shifting the blame onto his own shoulders for the current crisis. That is said to be one key reason why Deng turned against Zhao, who had been his handpicked successor. But China's elder statesman would perhaps not have faced such an acute crisis had certain other character traits, stubbornness and inflexibility, not led him into trouble, with a refusal to negotiate or compromise with the students. There's history here, too. Deng's refusal to bend in deference to Chairman Mao was one reason for his ouster during the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, and again in 1976, when he would not compromise in the face of attacks by Mao's widow and other radicals, and was sacked for a second time. After periods in disgrace, Deng was rehabilitated twice, something of a record for China, emerging to lead the country down the path of reform.
But this time, with Deng clinging to power on a conservative backlash, the outcome may be quite different.
This confrontation is being described as Deng Xiaoping's final battle. For now, the old warrior appears to be emerging victorious. But in the long run, there are many here who believe that it is Deng's country that will be the loser. Mike Chinoy, CNN, Beijing.
This week's emergency summit meeting of the Arab League has come to a close with strong support for the
On the demonstrations for political reform in Tiananmen Square and the struggle for political power within the Chinese Communist Party, here is CNN's Mike Chinoy.
In Tiananmen Square Friday, thousands of students voted to continue their protest. But on China's evening newscast, it was clear the hardliners in the leadership had gained the upper hand. Chinese TV anchors read a series of messages indicating growing support for martial law from China's civilian and military leaders. These signs coincided with reports that Communist Party chief Zhao Ziyang had been purged and was under some form of house arrest. Several of Zhao's liberal associates were also said to have been sacked and in custody. There was no way to confirm these reports independently. So far, the tens of thousands of troops deployed around Beijing in recent days have not been ordered back into the city. But the authorities are taking measures to curb the size of the protest, announcing on television Friday that provincial and regional governments were being ordered not to allow students to travel by train to Beijing. So far, the leadership struggle has been conducted totally behind the scenes, and there's been no public announcement of the outcome. That is not expected until a plenary session of the Communist Party's Central Committee is held, possibly this weekend, after which the full scale of the purge and of its consequences for China will become clear. Mike Chinoy, CNN, Beijing.
President Bush. Demonstrators in China have proposed ending their 2-week occupation of Tiananmen Square, but students say they plan to have one more massive rally to celebrate what they call their great victory. CNN's Brian Jenkins is in Beijing. Brian, what's the latest?
Well, Rick, students on Tiananmen Square are rising to day 16 of their sit-in, sleep-in protest, and they're loosening up for a march 4 hours from now. Student leaders are hoping to breathe new life into their campaign for democracy with today's demonstration. They're hoping working people and journalists and intellectuals will come back out on the street, will help recreate the magic of this protest movement at its height, will show the 5,000 or so diehards still camped out on Tiananmen Square that their cause is not lost, that their sacrifice is not forgotten. But the steam has clearly gone out of the protest. The student leaders know it, and last night they announced that after today's march they will hold one last hurrah on Tuesday. Then they say they will call on their fellow students to pull up stakes and go back to their campuses. The only question mark left, then, it would seem, is whether the hardliners running the government will give the students the chance to drift away on their own, or whether those hardliners, led by China's supreme leader, Deng Xiaoping, and Premier Li Peng, will decide that they've lost enough face and have heard enough calls on the street for their resignations. All the reports we've heard this week say there are tens of thousands of troops, at least, camped outside Beijing, and about 700 soldiers bivouacked in a closed park across from the square. It would seem the hardliners would consider it better public relations to let the students leave the square on their own accord instead of sending in troops to clear them off, but the hardliners have miscalculated many times in the past month, and it's not inconceivable that they would suddenly resort to heavy-handed tactics just to show everyone in China and around the world who's in charge here. Rick?
President Bush and the First Lady place a wreath at a memorial for American soldiers who were killed in World War II.
By the student demonstrators in Tiananmen Square have been dashed as government hardliners win a bitter power struggle among China's Communist Party elite. But even as aging revolutionary Deng Xiaoping appears to be regaining the upper hand, the students vote to continue their protest. And some Chinese leaders say the hardliners may be able to cling to the reins of power, but they have lost the hearts of their people.
Hundreds of thousands of people remained in Tiananmen Square hours after martial law was declared, and more were pouring in from all over the city. It was an extraordinary act of defiance, matched only by the huge crowds elsewhere which gathered to block the roads leading into the city center, preventing tens of thousands of soldiers from reaching the square and breaking up the protest. Workers in large numbers joined the students in stopping the troops. "Don't do this," they cried. "Don't do this." In many areas, the soldiers backed down, halting their advance, in some cases retreating. As the people responded to the government's crackdown by putting their bodies on the line, Chinese television repeatedly broadcast Premier Li Peng's strongly worded speech, as well as details of the new martial law regulations. These put most of Beijing under military rule and imposed severe restrictions on news reporting. Just how severe became clear when Chinese officials came to CNN's office here, ordering the network to cease its transmission.
Now I'm here announcing that CNN should stop the movable Earth station and its transmitting frequencies right away.
Our policy is the government has ordered us to shut down our facility. We are shutting down our facility.
Everything is peaceful in this nation, even though the government here has declared martial law.
Throughout the day, Army helicopters swooped low over the heart of Beijing. Some dropped leaflets warning that force would be used if the demonstrators didn't give up. But the size of the crowd grew and grew, with people from all walks of life pouring into the square, furious at the government's decision to crack down, determined to support the strikers and their demands for political reform.
The tension had been tightening since sunset. The voice of authority echoed over the darkened streets. Go home and you won't be punished. A chill warning to the crowd still pouring into the square. On Tiananmen itself, another drama was unfolding. Student leaders held a crisis meeting at their command center. Then came the crackly announcement. The hunger strike was over, provisionally called off to protect the students' lives. It was heralded as a great victory, not a back down.
You're not scared of the soldiers?
I'm not scared. I will stay here. I'm not scared. I really respect the soldiers even before my coming here. It's a matter. Somebody got to make some sacrifice.
During the night, more army reinforcements were moved into the outskirts of Beijing. Truckloads of troops, lines of armored personnel carriers. On top of each one, machine guns half hidden under canvas covers. They were soon surrounded by crowds of Beijing citizens, barricading the way into the city center. Some people clambered onto the army vehicles. Others tried to persuade the soldiers not to go on, not to harm the students.
I think if people defeat, if people will be defeated, I want to die. I think the China will no future. It is a black future for China.
As day broke, thousands were still coming to the square in support of the students, striking in the name of democracy. Many of the students seemed scared, most angry and dumbfounded at the government's final response to their demands for freedom. On the northern outskirts of Beijing, a line of tanks blocked in a village street. The Chinese T-54s had been driven down from Inner Mongolia only to be halted by peaceful resistance. 14 tanks in all held hostage by the people. Villagers said they counted 26 more a short distance away. The tank commanders told villagers they didn't know what was going on. They hadn't been allowed to read newspapers in days. Some thought they'd come to shoot films, not people.
The Chinese people just asked them why you exercise in the Peking city. We don't know. We can't. We decide our government is not very good.
Buses blockaded most routes into Beijing, bringing public transport to a standstill. Students ruled the roads, policing much of this confused city. Crowds gathered to discuss the political situation, anxious to speak out despite the military threat.
It's a best chance to advance and to forward.
Late Sunday afternoon, military helicopters again flew over the square of Heavenly Peace, dropping leaflets calling on the protesters to leave. Those in power were still hoping to frighten the demonstrators away. Yet, with fists clenched, the students pledged to stay on to the death. Expecting the worst, 2 students decided to get engaged. Bemused British tourists came to find out what was happening.
It could be something really big here, but maybe one of the first states, communist states to fall.
As the 5 o'clock deadline passed, students broke into spontaneous applause. Despite official threats, no troops had come to evict them from the square. With relief, the demonstrators broke into song. Motorbikes roared through the streets in noisy celebration. The city had survived 2 nights of martial law, but it was too early to confirm a victory for people power. It had been a long, confusing night of rumors and reports. First came word of an ultimatum from Premier Li Peng that the students would be suppressed if they didn't leave the square. This later denied by 2 influential army marshals. There were unconfirmed reports that Premier Li and Deng Xiaoping had been dismissed. Even so, students planned a retreat, but then vowed not to give up the square. Buses barricading roads into the city had their tires let down to thwart any military advance. Some protesters wore gas masks in case of attack. More medical staff arrived in readiness for possible bloodshed. As ever, the crowds kept coming to help protect the symbolic heart of this freedom campaign. Yet the night passed calmly. By Monday daybreak, the people were cautiously welcoming the dawn of a new era in China. The People's Army had been halted in its tracks by barricades, by reason, and sometimes by stronger methods. One troop truck had its fuel pipe severed, its tires deflated. Soldiers admitted they were in retreat, mentally, if not yet physically. They told the people they'd been tricked by those in power. They no longer believed the government. An army immobilized by the unresolved fight for control of China's Communist Party. It was hard to know just who was under siege in China's capital.
I'm not about to suggest what I think they ought to do, except to spell out peaceful and continue to fight for what you believe in.
I really believe the president has a greater responsibility than just describe the situation. China is one in flux.
I'd like to thank everybody for their understanding and cooperation. I'd like to thank you all for your cooperation.
Why should you buy Sherwin-Williams pen?
Crackdown on the student demonstrators and implementation of economic and political reforms. Secretary of State James Baker says the uprising is a sign that democratic ideals have taken hold among China's 1 billion people.
It is the philosophy of the West that they are...
They are risking their life for the future of China.
I'm crying for them. I'm moved by them. I want to save the students' life. I want to save democracy.
You've got millions of Chinese students and workers carrying statues of the Statue of Liberty, quoting Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. This is a profoundly significant event and deserves far more of a response from the president.
Well, in a sense, you know, both Gorbachev and Mr. Bush have similar problems. To some extent, each of them supports the movement towards democracy, openness, and so forth. Although Mr. Gorbachev's initial remarks on that when he went to Beijing were not encouraging. But ultimately,
it is in United States' interest to express whatever support is possible to what's going on, the democratic movement in China. I think it's Chinese people's struggle is universal. It's not only for people in China and also for people in the world.
People here say as long as there's no violence, it's best for the U.S. to stay on the sidelines and encourage the democratic wave that seems to be sweeping the People's Republic.
the base of the power for a long time has been the army. Ever since the Cultural Revolution, the army has played the critical political role, and that's why Deng Xiaoping, from his position on the military commission, is capable of running the country, or has been.
Quarterly
quickly closing.
The citizens of Beijing demonstrating their opposition to the imposition of martial law and the deployment of troops in the streets. 3 members of the security forces actually joined the protest. Chairman Mao once wrote that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. And with the students still on the streets, the armed forces here are playing an increasingly important and complex role in this crisis. But there is growing uncertainty over which side some of these troops would be on if the high-level power struggle produces a showdown in the streets. Well before the martial law declaration, soldiers from the 38th Army, which normally defends Beijing, refused orders to suppress the demonstrators, influenced by the students' appeals for them to join the protest. The Army's commander was reportedly forced to resign. Since last weekend, it's become clear many of the troops brought in to enforce martial law were also reluctant to act. One sign, this remarkable interview with an Army officer broadcast on Chinese television.
Of course we won't open fire.
The military's evident unease was reinforced when 100 senior officers signed a letter opposing the use of force. Now, however, the official People's Daily has reported that the political commissars of the Chinese Navy and Air Force, plus some of the country's regional military commands, have sent a message to the government supporting martial law.
The base of the power for a long time has been the Army. Ever since the Cultural Revolution, the Army has played the critical political role, and that's why Deng Xiaoping, from his position on the military commission, is capable of running the country, or has been.
He is 84 years old, in frail health, hard of hearing, poised, for months it had seemed, to relinquish his hold on power. But now, Deng Xiaoping is fighting for his political life, and is bringing to this struggle the accumulated contacts, skills, and personality traits built up during a half a century at the heart of China's political storm. From the 1930s until today, Deng has worked side by side with the men who now run the Chinese armed forces. So it's no surprise that it was this old boy network which Deng called on to rescue him from the anger of the masses, an anger that came closer to forcing China's elder statesmen from office than anyone here thought possible. Deng's handling of the crisis reveals other characteristics of a man who, until recently, had been widely viewed abroad as an attractive and forward-looking leader. Those who've dealt with him say he is a person with a long political memory, that he forgets nothing and forgives nothing, that he was deeply wounded by the personal attacks on him made by the protesters, and even more upset when Communist Party Chief Zhao told Soviet leader Gorbachev and the rest of the world that Deng retained ultimate responsibility for government policies here. A statement Deng is said to have interpreted as shifting the blame onto his own shoulders for the current crisis. That is said to be one key reason why Deng turned against Zhao, who had been his handpicked successor. But China's elder statesman would perhaps not have faced such an acute crisis had certain other character traits, stubbornness and inflexibility, not led him into trouble, with a refusal to negotiate or compromise with the students. There's history here, too. Deng's refusal to bend in deference to Chairman Mao was one reason for his ouster during the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, and again in 1976, when he would not compromise in the face of attacks by Mao's widow and other radicals, and was sacked for a second time. After periods in disgrace, Deng was rehabilitated twice, something of a record for China, emerging to lead the country down the path of reform. But this time, with Deng clinging to power on a conservative backlash, the outcome may be quite different.
The letter says the soldiers have come to Beijing in accordance with the strong wishes of the masses.
Come in now to see the new...
Cut off from satellite transmissions out of Beijing only 24 hours after the ban on feeding video had been lifted.
I think the most significant sign was turning off the American television. I think that this revolutionary movement is fueled mainly by American ideology and, strangely enough, by the example of successful democracy and economic progress in the Republic of China on Taiwan. But the thing that makes it all work and permitted the momentum of these extraordinary events to develop was television. television is probably the revolutionary ingredient that made the difference.
To show the people that he and conservative backers have come out on top in a week-long power struggle, Chinese Premier Li Peng appeared on state-run television meeting with foreign diplomats. It was Li's first public appearance since declaring martial law last Saturday, and while he didn't say a crackdown was coming, he did stress the need to restore order. And he politely suggested that outsiders should stay out of China's internal affairs. The government newscast also showed troops setting up camps outside Beijing and applauding their civilian commanders. Newscasters read a letter from those commanders to the troops asking for their help in, quote, crushing the plot of bad elements, unquote, presumably referring to student protesters.
The letter says the soldiers have come to Beijing in accordance with the strong wishes of the masses.
But some of the masses say they're still with the students in their movement for democracy and will try to counter the messages being cranked out by the Communist Party's propaganda machine. One group of working people announced they would back up the students on Tiananmen Square until the bitter end. One student leader said his comrades did not believe the battle for power among China's top leaders had been settled, and that the protesters will stay put until the government talks with them or until soldiers carry them away. As they gathered to sing patriotic songs, the students seemed prepared to face anything that comes, even the use of force, without resorting to violence themselves. Their peaceful campaign for reform, they realized, could quickly be cut short.
The political crisis triggered by the student protest campaign here appears to be nearing a climax. With increasing signs, the hardliners may be winning out. The plane that carried Chinese Parliament Chairman Wan Li back from his state visit to the United States arrived in Beijing. But Wan was not on board. As his entourage deplaned, it emerged that Wan had gotten off in Shanghai. This appears to dash hopes that Wan might be able to play a mediating role in the crisis.
In Tiananmen Square Friday, thousands of students voted to continue their protest. But on China's evening newscast, it was clear the hardliners in the leadership had gained the upper hand. Chinese TV anchors read a series of messages indicating growing support for martial law from China's civilian and military leaders. These signs coincided with reports that Communist Party Chief Zhao Ziyang had been purged and was under some form of house arrest. Several of Zhao's liberal associates were also said to have been sacked and in custody. So far, the tens of thousands of troops deployed around Beijing in recent days have not been ordered back into the city. But the authorities are taking measures to curb the size of the protest, announcing on television Friday that provincial and regional governments were being ordered not to allow students to travel by train to Beijing.
This confrontation is being described as Deng Xiaoping's final battle. For now, the old warrior appears to be emerging victorious. But in the long run, there are many here who believe that it is Deng's country that will be the loser.
Ending their sit-in at Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Sunday, more than 50,000 students marched in Beijing to demand the ouster of Li Peng, but the democracy movement appears to be waning. Although the students stole the spotlight a week earlier, this week their protests and their demands became the background for a behind-the-scenes political drama.
Like the protesters, throughout the week, the rumor mill ran roughshod through the streets of Beijing. Was senior leader Deng Xiaoping dead or just traveling in the provinces? Was Communist Party Chief Zhao Ziyang in or out? Army convoys heading into Beijing or out to their barracks? And official news reports of growing or lagging support for martial law provided clues of the power struggle. At the start of the week, the government issued an ultimatum to the mass of demonstrators gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square for more than 2 weeks. Leaflets threatened a crackdown.
Of course I'm not afraid. None of us are afraid. We don't believe Premier Li Peng will get away with suppressing the movement.
But no crackdown came. Instead, a handful of soldiers joined the marchers. 100 military officers, including a former defense minister and a former Army chief of staff, signed a letter criticizing martial law and refusing to use force.
Of course we won't open fire.
All of it fueled speculation that political hardliners, like 84-year-old Deng Xiaoping and Premier Li Peng, had lost this political battle to those opposed to martial law. That meant Zhao Jiang, the head of China's Communist Party, a man considered a reformist, had not been ousted as previously rumored. In Tiananmen Square, an ink-splattered portrait of the revered Mao Zedong was quickly replaced. Protesting college students camped out in the square denied responsibility. Students nabbed 3 men who confessed to lobbing ink-filled eggs at the portrait and turned the 3 over to police. The official news media highlighted reports of military units withdrawing from Beijing. Ordinary people had jammed the streets and erected roadblocks to protect the tent city set up by the students. In an unprecedented move, the official media reported that protesters openly criticized Prime Minister Li Peng and demanded his resignation. Meanwhile, President George Bush urged China's leaders to talk with the demonstrators.
We do support freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and clearly we support democracy. I know I don't want to be gratuitous in giving advice, but I would encourage restraint. I do not want to see bloodshed.
Mr. Bush met with Wan Li, the head of China's National People's Congress, and promised closer ties if China resists violence against the students and when China allows more political and economic freedom. Wan Li cut short his visit to Washington. He was reportedly heading home to convene the Congress for a vote on ending martial law and removing Li as prime minister. Instead, the head of the People's Congress was sidetracked in Shanghai for unspecified medical reasons. He was then quoted as supporting martial law and blaming the chaos on a small clique trying to overthrow the government. With that veiled reference to the government's line against Zhao, signs of the impending political shift began to surface. Prime Minister Li Peng emerged publicly and confidently and on Chinese TV for the first time since he had imposed martial law. Government newspapers reported solid military support for the premier's martial law decree. Crowds in Tiananmen Square dwindled from more than 50,000 to some 5,000 students. By week's end, Chinese television showed students leaving Beijing by train. Zhao Jiang, last seen in public before martial law, was reportedly stripped of power and arrested. Meanwhile, the Communist Party Central Committee prepared to meet. Among its duties, ratifying any leadership changes. It appeared the hardliners had won in the halls of power, but the students in Tiananmen Square had staked out a moral victory. For the Week in Review, I'm Rick Moore.
Among others, the eyes and ears of Chinese nationals throughout the world have been glued to news accounts of the demonstrations and the political shifts. Their mouths, and those of their supporters, echoed the angry cries that filled Tiananmen Square.
The drama of Tiananmen Square brought supporters to their feet around the world. More than 400,000 out of nearly 6 million people in Hong Kong took to the streets to show support for those calling for more democracy in China. Police said it was the biggest political demonstration ever seen in the British colony. In Macau, a Portuguese territory on China's southern coast, more than 7,000 demonstrators braved gusts of wind and bursts of rain from an approaching typhoon. In London, more than 1,000 Chinese students lent their support.
Liberty! Liberty! Freedom! Freedom!
Across North America, thousands of Chinese exchange students raised their voices in unison.
Nobody granted them this freedom of speech, but they dare to speak them out now. That's really a turning point in the Chinese history. No matter the government, what government will do, surprising or not, but the people will not be the same people, and the country will not be the same country.
Democracy! Democracy! Freedom! Freedom! I am proud of being a Chinese. I am proud of Chinese people, but I'm ashamed of having such a government.
Many students, thousands, are studying in the United States and the free world, and they're getting educated, they're tasting freedom.
Demonstrators massed in front of the Chinese embassy in Washington. Hundreds of Chinese students and Canadians of Chinese origin converged on the Chinese embassy in Canada.
Education Chancellor from the Chinese embassy expressed his support to the Chinese student democratic movement.
The chaos and violence of China's Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 70s generated an outpouring of Chinese-American concern. This time, there were no big fundraisers, not even in San Francisco's Chinatown.
The older people, they left China so long ago, even before Mao Zedong, you know, so that it doesn't make any difference, I guess.
This time, many Chinese-Americans don't predict a bloodletting. And this time, they have a better idea of what's going on.
Students marched through Beijing on Sunday, calling for the ouster of hardline Premier Li Peng. It's now 11 a.m. Monday in China. CNN's Brian Jenkins is following the situation in Beijing. Brian, are the demonstrations coming to an end, or will they stay there until they're pushed out?
Well, the next 36 hours may tell. Right now, it's an overcast Monday morning in Beijing, and the students camped out on Tiananmen Square are in a generally gloomy mood. The Sunday march they held on the streets of central Beijing attracted less than 100,000 students and few, if any, working people. The word clearly came down from the Communist Party apparatus to the workplaces that joining in any further protest could lead to a cut in pay or a pink slip, and finding a new job in a socialist authoritarian society is, of course, nearly impossible. So the students can see that their public support in Beijing has all but vanished, and leaders of the protest are calling for one final march tomorrow, a last hurrah, before clearing off the square. Still, there was some talk last night among campers on the square of staying put until June 20th, when the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress is scheduled to hold a meeting to discuss the social unrest in China. The next 36 hours, as I said, should tell whether the students will hang tough or hang up their sit-in. Rick?
Brian, has the situation changed any with the Chinese army troops that were nearby and with their equipment? Are they any closer? Do they give any impression that they're ready to move in and displace the demonstrators off the square?
There have not been any troop movements, although yesterday there were reports that there were about 700 soldiers bivouacked in a closed park opposite the square. Certainly, that number of soldiers does not indicate that they are prepared to move in and try to forcibly lift the students off the square. There have been no other troop movements, but there are clearly tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of troops camped out in areas outside Beijing and could be called in if necessary. However, the consensus here at this point seems to be that the government will not want to use troops to clear the students, would not want to risk bloodshed, are hoping the students will indeed go away on their own, and that perhaps the troops are posted not so much to scare the students, but to scare any more reform-minded leaders within the Communist Party apparatus who might be attempting to make some sort of comeback through military means.
Brian, you mentioned retributions against workers who might join the students. What about retributions against the students? Do you think they will be arrested, that they will be kicked out of college? What might happen to them?
That is a big question here right now. There were reports in the past 24 hours that some of the students who were trying to take trains back to their provincial cities out of Beijing were being stopped and were asked to produce ID. There is some concern that the authorities are now taking names, that there could be retribution in the future. The students might not be jailed, but upon graduation they might find it nearly impossible to obtain the kind of work that they would like to have. It's been known in the past to have new graduates shipped out into the far countryside and put into undesirable jobs, so that's certainly a possibility. However, the hardliners are trying to be somewhat conciliatory in their statements to the students through the public media. The party central committee and the state council put out a statement through the Xinhua news agency saying that the they fully affirm the students' patriotic enthusiasm and will not investigate and punish those students who have voiced and committed extremist words and acts. So the words of the government seem to be somewhat conciliatory, and yet what their actions will be remains to be seen.
All right, thanks, Brian. Brian Jenkins reporting live from Beijing. David?
Protests in solidarity with China's student demonstrators continue around the world. In Hong Kong, it was said to be the largest rally ever in the British territory. Police say hundreds of thousands of people jammed the streets in a massive pro-democracy march. Hong Kong returns to Chinese rule in 1997. One local businessman said when it comes to democracy, quote, "We have not lost the war." Here in the U.S., pro-democracy marchers gathered in New York City for a rally in front of the Chinese consulate. About 700 of the group, many of them Chinese students, marched to the consulate from the United Nations. And in Los Angeles, about 30 students from China and Hong Kong held a 24-hour fast in support of the movement in China. The fast began yesterday, and one of the hunger strikers said while the hardliners are cracking down in Beijing, from what he hears, the demonstrators in Tiananmen Square will stay on.
From the news that I heard from phone calls from Beijing, they told me that the strike is not over. Students will be staying in Tiananmen, and it's not over.
Those hunger strikers are currently studying here in America, and several California universities are involved.
Still to come on the evening news, 10,000 motorcyclists roar through the streets of the nation's capital. We'll tell you why. In Amarillo, Texas,
to erect a roadblock with buses and trucks several hundred yards from the square. There have been reports that a bus load of carrying soldiers with automatic weapons was seen near the square, but has not yet reached the square. As word of this development has spread around Beijing, small groups of people have begun to emerge and gather on street corners. There are some small makeshift barricades similar to, but not yet of the same scale that we saw about not quite 2 weeks ago when martial law was first announced. It's a situation full of tension at the moment. The crowd seething up and down the main avenue in the direction of Tiananmen Square. So far, however, there is no indication that there has been any actual conflict or violence, but clearly the people here believe something is afoot, and they have moved out in large numbers to block access to the square in the event the soldiers should try and sweep the area clean.
Mike, it's now about 3 o'clock Saturday morning there. What precipitated this latest string of events?
It's hard to tell exactly. There have been persistent reports throughout the week that the hardliners in leadership wanted to move as quickly as possible to clear the square and reassert their control. There had, in fact, been some specific reports saying that the hardliners intended to move troops in by the end of the week. So that, I suspect, is as good a reason as any for what's going on now. The obvious big question, if in fact this turns into a major military push, is what the response of the people will be, whether or not the public will react in the way that it did right after the imposition of martial law with what amounted to a popular uprising, and whether, if that in fact is the case, the troops will be forced to use a degree of violence that could trigger massive instability. The situation just in front of me now, crowds seething back and forth on Chang'an Boulevard, the main drag leading into Tiananmen Square, milling around, a lot of shouting and pushing, but so far no visible signs of conflict. But that appears at this stage could be just a matter of time before the troops actually attempt to come in and clear the square. They're going to have a hard job. The crowd is big, and it appears angry and intense.
Mike, can you see from your vantage points whether the troops are armed?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Yes, Mike, can you see from your vantage point whether the troops are armed?
No, at this stage it's difficult to actually physically make out the presence of troops. There's such a big crowd in the street. Moving down the boulevard, there's kind of an angry hum going through the crowd. I'll put the telephone out. I don't know if you can hear it for a moment.
Yes, we can hear that, Mike. Is the crowd
But there is no at this point sign of physical confrontation that I can see. But the people here are clearly ready to move out and ready to resist any effort made to break them up. Although up to now it should be stressed that the students have consistently said throughout this protest they wanted to remain peaceful, and they have vowed not to resist in a violent way. But clearly they are not going to go home in response to pressures either.
Mike, is the crowd almost making it impossible for the troops to move into the square?
Sorry, could you repeat that again, please?
Mike, is the crowd almost making it impossible, the students, for the troops to get into Tiananmen Square?
The crowd would certainly make it a bit more difficult, although I think clearly if the troops wanted to use force and assert their authority, they could do so. I mean, this is a group of unarmed people here who would be no match for armed soldiers following orders. But at this stage of the game, it would require a move by the military to really push these people back, and we see no sign of that. At this point, the crowd is now beginning to move away, a little bit away from the direction of the square. There are some vehicles with sirens trying to make their way through the crowd. It's very, very hard, even from this vantage point, to be able to judge exactly where this is going. But people are clearly very upset. You see some people waving red banners and are bracing themselves at this point for some kind of confrontation.
Mike, there were reports there was a confrontation at the Beijing hotel. Can you see that hotel from where you are?
Yes, I am. As I say, the word confrontation should be used cautiously in the sense that there are clearly large clouds of people on the streets. They are moving. They are angry. But at this point, there is not physical violence. I now see some people in the crowd. We think from our vantage point that we can see some people in uniform, but it's very hard to tell. A large roar is coming up from the crowd at this stage, but it's very difficult to figure out where this is going. The crowd looks to be moving slowly in the direction of the Beijing municipal government offices and the Beijing Garrison Command, which is next to it, moving slowly in that direction away from Tiananmen Square.
Mike, can we talk about the timing of this? How is the media playing a role in what is happening today in terms of press restrictions?
Well, clearly the press restrictions, we had all speculated that when the government announced tougher restrictions, that might have something to do with a plan for moving in on the soldiers, that the government wanted to ensure a minimum of press coverage, and that obviously is part of the calculation. But at this point, the press is not being physically restricted, although clearly all of the reporting being done is in violation of martial law.
Mike, at this point, you don't know who these troops are or what their intention is.
We do not yet know from which element of the military there are. There were reports that soldiers from at least had almost a dozen different army groups from around China have been massed outside Beijing. They've been there now for nearly 2 weeks. Up till now, the government has stressed in its propaganda that the troops were not interested in firing on the people or fighting with the people, that for all of the harsh rhetoric and so on, that the government wanted a peaceful end to this. And at this point, even though the crowds are moving through the streets, even though there is an atmosphere of high tension, there is no physical violence that I can see. Nobody is being beaten. or hit or shot or tear gas, anything of that nature. But people are clearly out on the streets in large numbers in and around Tiananmen Square, and it would be my guess that as word spreads throughout the city, it is quite possible that people will begin to gather elsewhere, although one of the big questions in this clearly will be whether or not the public responds in the way in which it did before. That would obviously determine the ease with which the authorities would be able to successfully complete this operation, if in fact this is the beginning of an operation that will see troops physically sweep people out, whatever the resistance they put up.
We are receiving some pictures being transmitted that were taken about an hour ago of the events at Tiananmen Square, and keep in mind it is now 3:09 Saturday morning there. Mike, again, you have not heard any gunshots.
No, we've heard no gunfire. We've seen no tear gas from where I'm standing, and I have quite a good view of the overall situation. I've seen no violence whatever. That has been throughout this whole drama one of the more remarkable facts, that it has been extraordinarily peaceful, both sides, for all of the harsh rhetoric on the government side and the sense of resistance on the part of the protesters have been extraordinarily peaceful, and clearly neither side wanted to have this end in violence if it could be avoided. And at this point, even with what is going on right now, there is no physical violence, but that obviously could change depending on the nature of the circumstances.
CNN's Mike Shinoy, we know you'll stay on the line and continue to update us on the situation in Beijing, and we'll have more of Newsday in just a moment.
We have a man in
March 3 weeks. The troops advanced down Shangan Avenue, the capital's main street. Some were blocked by a bus and truck, apparently driven by students, several hundred yards east of the vast square, occupied by nearly 10,000 student activists. The soldiers, who wore khaki pants and white shirts, did not appear to be armed. No clashes were immediately reported. Again, we will continue to update you on the events in Tiananmen Square in Beijing.
And Flip Spiceland is standing by now to tell us what kind of...
subsided a little bit, although within sight of where I'm speaking, a crowd of perhaps several hundred soldiers is slowly moving away from the square, surrounded by an exuberant but not hostile crowd of protesters. The troops had attempted to come in the direction of Tiananmen Square but did not in fact make it, and when they were met by this large crowd, turned around and shuffled away. There has, I must repeat, so far been no violence, no physical confrontation, but the troops are now moving away. The protesters have set up a couple of makeshift barricades on the main roads leading out of Tiananmen Square. There are three that I can see from my own vantage point. They've taken the metal fencing which divides this broad avenue and moved it around so that it blocks much of the access, although cars are still able to squeeze through. The sense, the mood among the protesters is one of jubilation. They seem very pleased with themselves for having faced off this detachment of troops that was moving their way, although it seems very unclear at this point what the troops were actually doing. We'll have to seek some clarification on that. They clearly were not coming in for a major, massive swoop, but clearly it's the middle of the night and they weren't out just taking a stroll, but their precise purpose, whether it was for intimidation or a show of force, remains unclear at this point.
Mike, we had reported that the students were using buses and trucks in this blockade against the troops. Can you see that from where you are?
Not at the moment. A few minutes ago, there were a couple of buses and some trucks that were blocking part of this main street. They now seem to have moved away as the soldiers have fallen back. And so at the moment, there are no blockades of that nature within my view. Whether there are any others around Beijing elsewhere at this point from where I'm standing, I'm not able to say. But the crowds are still out in the streets. They're several thousand strong here and several thousand strong right in the center of Tiananmen Square. Not nearly as big, one must point out, as the crowds the weekend that martial law was declared 2 weeks ago. But then again, the general size of the protest has dwindled somewhat since then. But still a sizable number, and still clearly determined to stay put and not to be intimidated by any show of military strength in whatever form.
Okay, Mike Shinoy, thank you very much for that update from Beijing. Don?
The latest movement in Beijing has the wheels beginning to turn in Washington. Anthony Collins is standing by the State Department now with the latest from his perspective. Anthony?
Yes, here at the State Department, officials are monitoring the situation very closely. They've been on the telephone to the American Embassy in Beijing, and the reports that they have received are that some 5,000 Army troops, unarmed, did march along Jianong Avenue, the main east-west road in Beijing, toward the Tiananmen Square, and then, as we've heard from Mike Shinoy, whatever possible confrontation might have been looming dissipated. The officials here say that they did not see any weapons carried by the troops, and they had no reports of any violence coming back here to the State Department from the embassy in Beijing. Officials say that they are as puzzled as are most other people as to what exactly is going on. One official told me, we're watching CNN to find out what's going on in Beijing. In the past, the State Department has repeatedly made it clear to the Chinese authorities that the United States would like to urge restraint on both sides, the avoidance of any violence. At the same time, the statements by the Bush administration have favored the demonstrators, have encouraged any moves toward democracy. But the basic mood here is one of puzzlement, waiting to see what happens next, and relief that apparently there is no violence so far in this latest development.
Anthony, in case there were to be violence, what kind of physical action would the State Department take, or would they just take a wait-and-see attitude, as you suggest they've done so far?
It's certainly possible, in view of the past statements urging restraint, that there would be a condemnation of violence by the Bush administration. Possibly, if this were to result in any strains in America's relations with China, there could be a number of diplomatic moves, the kinds of things that diplomats do when they want to indicate displeasure with developments in another country. There could be a reduction in cultural contacts. Also, I should add that the officials here are telling me that a travel advisory that was issued on May 26th, urging Americans to avoid travel to China, that advisory remains in effect. And that is because the situation, as we have seen, is still very much unsettled.
Okay, Anthony Collins at the State Department, thank you very much for that. And we just remind you, as Mike Shinoy pointed out, from his vantage point, which is above Tiananmen Square from his hotel room, he sees that the troops are apparently backing down somewhat. And, of course, we'll continue to watch and monitor the situation there from his vantage point over the square. And we'll be back in just a moment.
Began moving toward Beijing's Tiananmen Square, but they appear now to have turned back. For the latest, let's go to Mike Shinoy in Beijing. Mike?
At this hour, there's another extraordinary scene in this absolutely remarkable drama that has been played out in China for the past several weeks. About 2 to 3,000 soldiers were moving in the direction of Tiananmen Square, apparently from Tongxian County in the eastern outskirts of Beijing. The soldiers got within a few hundred yards of the square, where they were met by a large crowd of protesters and, in a generally peaceful manner, turned back. The soldiers were not wearing normal military clothes. They were wearing light shirts and green pants. They were unarmed. Some of them were carrying satchels. And the citizens here, students and ordinary people, pushed them away, turned them around without much force. Now, at this hour, as I speak, I'm within sight of Tiananmen Square, and on the main boulevard leading out of Tiananmen Square, the Avenue of Heavenly Peace, the soldiers have moved back. Many of them are now rather bewildered and are standing or sitting by the side of the road and are being talked to in a very animated fashion by crowds of citizens. The soldiers said that they had been told they were coming to help restore order around here, specifically around the train station. They appear to have no real idea of what they were supposed to do, and they are now getting what I suppose you could call an education from the people in the streets. The people are trying to explain to them what is actually going on here, the purpose of this protest movement. The soldiers have orders not to talk to people, and so most of them are sitting silently, although some of them are, in fact, talking back. It's a remarkable scene, somewhat similar, although on a much smaller scale, to the scenes we witnessed 2 weekends ago when martial law was imposed and the citizens of Beijing turned out in huge numbers to block the entrance of soldiers into the city then. The soldiers now really seem rather bewildered. They don't seem sure where they should go next. They kind of shambled off from Tiananmen Square before ever reaching their goal and appear very uncertain about what they should do now. In the meantime, the crowds are out in the middle of the street, not quite in as big numbers as we have seen in the past couple of weeks, but still several thousand moving up and down Chang'an Boulevard, surrounding these soldiers. A couple of makeshift roadblocks have been set up on Chang'an Street, the protesters using the metal fencing in the middle of the road, twisting it around to make it more difficult for traffic to go through. It's not a roadblock that would stop any kind of serious military vehicle, but it does not appear that the soldiers were on a serious military mission. Some here speculate they were simply going to march through the top of Tiananmen Square as a show of force, but they don't have any weapons, and it was not sure what they were trying to do. On the other side of Tiananmen Square, a busload of about a half dozen soldiers with automatic weapons was stopped about a mile from the square, again by crowds. It's not clear what they were doing either. So from my vantage point, there are knots of people, several hundred or perhaps as many as 1,000 strong, dotted along Chang'an Boulevard in the darkness of the very, very early morning. The streetlights are still on. There have been no helicopters, no reinforcements or a visible sign of extra security forces being deployed. The mood is electric. The crowd seems jubilant that they have been able to push these soldiers back, although from my vantage point, they did not look like soldiers who were going to be much of a threat to anyone. There were earlier some cars or buses and trucks that were laid across parts of Chang'an Boulevard as barricades. They have now been taken down, but there were, as word spread of this around the city, knots of people gathering on street corners and a few makeshift barricades at other points in the city. As I drove towards Tiananmen within the last hour, that was visible, although not very many and not nearly to the extent that we saw when martial law was imposed. Clearly, this is a puzzling episode. It's not certain why it happened and not clear what the repercussions of it will be. But at this point, the students have scored some kind of moral and propaganda victory in turning these troops around.
Mike, was there ever any kind of a confrontation? In other words, did it appear from where you could see it, did it appear that the students were pushing the troops back, or did the troops just arbitrarily turn around and go back on their own?
If there was, I was not a witness to the very initial moments of this. It appeared at one point that the troops simply ran into a wall of people, but I do not get the impression that there was any serious violence or physical confrontation, that the troops simply turned around when it became clear their way was going to be blocked. As they turned around, the mood of the crowd was not hostile. Rather, as has been the case all along, it was friendly, and the crowds of people were trying to put their case to the soldiers, and so there was not any serious violence that I am aware of here. At this point, as I say, there are large crowds, several thousand strong, up and down the main street, but no violence, and the troops, most of them seem to be sitting along the side of the road. Some have sort of wandered off, but more of them are standing or sitting with a large crowd of people around them, talking to them in a very animated fashion. Some people are beginning to come into Tiananmen Square as word of this spreads. Bicyclists with red banners being waved by people sitting on the seat. It's not as big a crowd as the weekend of martial law was declared, but considering that martial law has been in effect for 2 weeks, it's an impressive crowd nonetheless.
Mike, thank you very much. Mike Chenoy in Beijing. We shall continue to follow the story in China from Beijing through Mike's eyes. Mike, thank you very much. Mike Chenoy in Beijing. We shall continue to follow the story in China from Beijing through Mike's eyes as the afternoon progresses. In just a moment, we'll get a report from the State Department when the International Hour continues.
In China, just a short time ago, several thousand soldiers moved toward student-held Tiananmen Square in Beijing. The student protesters and citizen supporters poured into the street, blocking the soldiers' path and forcing them to turn back. CNN's Mike Chenoy joins us on the phone now from Beijing with the latest. Mike?
It was a remarkable and somewhat puzzling episode, what has been going on here for the last couple of hours. Somewhere around 3,000 or 4,000 soldiers were seen marching towards Tiananmen Square about 2.5 hours ago. As they came within a couple of hundred yards of the square, crowds of people came rushing out from the square and from the surrounding streets to block their way. There was a standoff, there was some pushing and shoving, and then the soldiers retreated in some disarray. There was no real violence, nobody was hurt, no shots were fired, no clubs drawn or anything of that sort. It's not clear what the purpose of the soldiers was. They were not dressed in normal military uniforms. They had white shirts and green trousers on. Many of them were carrying satchels. It's not certain what was in them. At no point did they draw any weapons, and as I say, their mission remains uncertain. The soldiers fell back in a rather disorganized fashion, but not running, walking along the sidewalk of Chang'an Street, the main thoroughfare in Beijing. Many of them stopped about 500 or 600 yards from Tiananmen Square and sat down, apparently puzzled about what to do next. They were surrounded by crowds of protesters who lectured them and spoke with them and argued with them, trying to explain what was going on here. The soldiers said that they had been given orders not to talk to anyone, and many of them did remain silent, although some of them were engaged in conversation by the protesters. As word of this move spread around Beijing, people set up makeshift barricades along Chang'an Street for several hundred yards in either direction of Tiananmen Square. On the other side of Tiananmen Square, there were reports that a busload of security personnel, some of them carrying automatic weapons, was stopped a mile or two from the square, but again, there were no shots fired, and it's not clear what the situation there is now. In the square itself, things remained calm after the initial wave of tension had passed. The students played Beethoven's Ode to Joy from the Ninth Symphony over their loudspeaker system while all of this was going on. At the moment, from my vantage point, where I can see Tiananmen Square and Chang'an Street, there are knots of people, knots is perhaps not the right word, crowds of people, not that big, perhaps several hundred or 1,000 strong, dotted up and down Chang'an Street, the largest concentration being in the area where many of the soldiers have sat down in front of a large number of billboards, and where they are being engaged in conversation by the protesters. There have been groups of protesters on bicycles waving red banners, some of them bicycling out from Tiananmen Square, others bicycling in towards Tiananmen Square, some of them chanting, "Down with Li Peng," the hardline premier who imposed martial law 2 weeks ago. The atmosphere has calmed down a bit since the early excitement of a couple of hours ago. It remains, as I say, unclear what the purpose of this whole exercise was from the military's point of view. The soldiers were not armed, or at least not visibly armed. They were clearly not in a position to physically sweep the square. There has been no sign of any reinforcements for them. Whether this was intended as a show of strength or not is hard to say. Certainly it has had the opposite effect, galvanizing the protesters, bolstering their defiance, and again, as has happened repeatedly, making the authorities look weak and indecisive. The political ramifications of this, we'll have to wait for the day to break to see how the authorities respond, and also to see what the response is elsewhere in the city. But for now, anyway, the students have won another victory in their ongoing struggle with the government, having pushed these soldiers back and prevented them from even getting into or walking through Tiananmen Square.
Mike, could you give us some idea of the difference in the demonstrators now and during the height of the protests? Are there more of them or far fewer?
There's certainly fewer of them now, although the square was very, very packed about 10 or 12 hours ago when 4 well-known Chinese intellectual and cultural figures began a symbolic 72-hour hunger strike in support of the demonstrators' demands for greater democracy and freedom. Some estimates put the crowd then in the hundreds of thousands, which would make it one of the largest turnouts since the few days right after martial law. But at this hour, the crowds on the streets are much smaller than they were the last time there was a serious scare involving the possibility of troops being deployed, which was a week ago last Sunday night. The numbers are down. The atmosphere is not quite as electric, but still there are substantial crowds out in the streets, and I suspect as daybreak comes and word of this spreads, the crowds may grow. But at the moment, it's just before dawn here. The darkness of the night is slowly beginning to lift, and the numbers are not quite that big, but people are in the square. They are stationed at these corners where they've set up some makeshift barricades, and certainly there has been a kind of a shockwave of electricity, feeling tension that has gone through the protest movement, perhaps giving it another shot in the arm at a time when the government was hoping it would be dissipating.
Mike, normally at 5 o'clock in the morning, or so it is there, just after 5 o'clock in the morning, the activity would seem to die down a little bit under normal circumstances, as normal as one can be during a demonstration. How is that different now than it has been in the past, for instance? Is there more activity at this time in the morning?
There absolutely is more activity. Normally at this hour, even with the continuing occupation of Tiananmen Square, the main access roads in have been pretty quiet. The activity has been confined, certainly in the wee hours of the morning, to the square, and all you would normally see at this hour would be a few people on bicycles making their way along the main roads. People here in China do get up early, but 5 o'clock is a bit early even for a Chinese rush hour. Otherwise, the streets would be largely deserted, but in fact, what I am seeing as I speak to you now are several thousand people strung out along Chang'an Street, one large crowd about 300 yards from the square, right near the headquarters of one of the major Chinese security bureaus. Lots of people along the sidewalks, another crowd, a bit smaller, milling around where the soldiers are sitting or standing, talking to the soldiers in front of 4 or 5 big billboards diagonally across from the Beijing Hotel. And then further down the street, there are smaller crowds by the little barricades that have been set up and at the next intersection, which leads on to the Beijing train station. So there's much more activity than you would normally see at this hour, although it's not as animated or excited as it was an hour or two ago at the point when the soldiers first met up with the large crowds of people who blocked their way into Tiananmen Square.
Thank you. Mike Chenoy from Tiananmen Square in Beijing as the sun gets set to break over a very troubled Tiananmen Square. Bella?
In a moment, Dr. Anthony Kane, the director of the China Council of the Asia Society, will give his views of the uprising.
By tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers attempting to break up student demonstrations. When the confrontation in Tiananmen Square was over, the soldiers had turned back in disarray, and some of them were even seen crying. Students and workers have again blocked the Army's advance against their protest for democracy. CNN's Mike Chenoy is joining us on the phone right now in Beijing. Mike, you want to bring us up to date?
It has been an extraordinary 12 hours here in Beijing, symbolized perhaps by the roadblocks and barriers which were erected along Beijing's main thoroughfare, Chang'an Street, during the wee hours of the morning. Dozens and dozens of buses and big crowds of people blocked access to Tiananmen Square in an attempt to prevent the soldiers who'd been called out to reach the square from getting to their destination. The soldiers, who had come from the 67th Army based south of Beijing, were apparently under orders to move to the square and to occupy it, but to not physically evict the protesters there, in a sense to co-occupy it. evidently part of an attempt by the hardliners in the government to reassert their authority in the heart of China. But the soldiers met large crowds of protesters, both students and many ordinary citizens, and were turned back by this human wall. There was some minor punching and scuffling, but essentially not very much violence. The soldiers, all very young, seemed rather intimidated and frightened. None of them had gotten any clear instructions from their superiors as to what they were supposed to do, except they were not supposed to engage in active conflict with their fellow citizens. The soldiers then beat a retreat back down the main boulevard, Chang'an Street, away from Tiananmen Square, many of them leaving some of their belongings behind. It's interesting to note that these soldiers did not wear normal army uniforms. That is reportedly a violation of one of the major regulations of the Chinese armed forces, and has fueled suspicion that this was an attempt at some kind of backhanded move by the hardliners to get the military into the square. With the soldiers gone, and it is now midday here, the question is, what will happen next? These soldiers whom you see now retreating, this was several hours ago, they're gone, and the crowds in Tiananmen Square remain, the square filling up with supporters of the campaign for freedom and democracy. Everybody is wondering what the authorities will do next. There were some armed soldiers who were part of this push into the square. Several busloads full of troops carrying automatic weapons were also blocked by these kinds of big crowds, which gathered on both main access roads into Tiananmen. The buses in which the soldiers were traveling were stopped and surrounded, and in some cases the protesters actually managed to extract and get a hold of the weapons that the soldiers were carrying. No shots were fired, and there were no reports of any injuries or deaths during this confrontation. But now, with the soldiers' weapons idle and the troops who moved into the square having been forced to retreat, we are all, journalists, diplomats, and of course the people of Beijing, waiting to see how the government will respond. There is some concern and some fear that a larger, more forceful push could come. At the moment, there is no sign of it, and Tiananmen Square belongs, as it has for the past several weeks, to the protesting citizens of Beijing.
Mike, maybe you could give us your thoughts on why it is that the Beijing government has been so reluctant to go ahead and use force to clear the square, end all of this demonstrating.
I think there are a couple of very important reasons. The most significant is that even the harshest of the hardliners in the heart of Beijing, it would totally destroy this government's credibility with its own people. It would totally destroy this government's image internationally, with horrendous damage to China's foreign relations, particularly with the countries of the West, which it most needs to have close relations to get its economic development program onto the next stage. I think that is one restraining factor. Even the harshest of the conservatives realizes that if it's possible to do without bloodshed, it's much better to do it that way. The second question is that there remain doubts about the loyalty of the Chinese armed forces. In this entire process over the last 6 weeks, there have been military units and military commanders who have balked at being deployed in order to use force, in order to crush their own people. Many of the soldiers, it is thought, sympathize with the demands of the protesters for greater political freedom and democracy. The military is very reluctant to become involved in this kind of internal policekeeping operation in support of a faction in a very divided leadership. Most of the military would prefer to see their main task as modernizing and upgrading their own institution and defending China from foreign attack, which is, after all, the primary role of a country's armed forces. Both of these factors, I think, have restrained the leadership and still restrain it now, even after this abortive fiasco that we've witnessed over the past several hours.
All right, Mike Shinoy, thank you very much. Live report from Beijing, China.
Analysts watching events in Beijing tell CNN the government is approaching an inescapable decision. They say the leadership appears not to want to use brute force, but also doesn't seem to know what else will work.
It's a little hard to believe that they did not anticipate the possibility of the
thousands of troops this morning, Tom, that were moving in. We're now saying 300 to 400. Are you saying that there are additional soldiers that are moving toward the square?
It's difficult to say right now. There may be additional backup troops. These 400 were the first thrust off to one side. It came on the opposite direction that last night's original parry came from by the troops. The only number estimates we have so far, about 300 to 400. We have not seen any other troops in the area, but I'm sure they do have backups. The students, once again, have locked arms at that side of the square and are preventing those 300 to 400 troops from moving in. But tear gas has been used.
Tom, any report of other people other than the students joining in at this point in time?
Well, we understand that the Beijing police are the ones who have actually fired the tear gas. Some officers from the Beijing Police Department have evidently entered this confrontation. Up until now, the Beijing Police Department has simply stood on the street corner and directed traffic as best they could when the situation got a little hairy like it did this morning. They simply went back into their small little cubicles, and once the traffic was stalled with all the buses, they came back out and directed traffic. But it seems this afternoon here in Beijing that their role has changed in this confrontation somewhat, and it is possibly the police who have used the tear gas weapons against the students.
Tom, thank you very much. Tom Mantier reporting from Beijing, where 300 to 400 Chinese police, or Beijing police, are moving into Tiananmen Square and have fired tear gas in the square at the students who are protesting there. We'll be back with more in just a moment. Fired tear gas at protesting students. The police are trying to clear the entrance of the Communist Party headquarters just west of Tiananmen Square. Also, there are reports that hundreds of policemen using clubs and tear gas attacked demonstrators who had seized a military bus full of arms and ammunition. The police charged the tens of thousands of demonstrators milling around the bus full of machine guns and AK-47s, according to an eyewitness. CNN's Tom Mantier reports the students have linked arms and have been successful so far in keeping troops out of the symbolic heart of China. Mantier also indicates that Beijing police are now joining in attempts to break up the pro-democracy demonstrations. This is the second time in 13 hours that the government has launched an assault on the square. Early Saturday morning in Beijing, the Chinese army finally made its move to break up the student protest. Long lines of troops coming from all directions marched towards Tiananmen Square, but once again, students, workers, and Beijing residents rushed into the streets and stopped them. They pleaded with the soldiers not to break up the pro-democracy demonstration, saying the People's Army should not turn on the army of the people of Beijing. Well, if you're looking for something to do this weekend, here's Carol Buckland with a look at what's hot and what's not at the movie.
Past the headquarters of the Chinese Communist Party near Tiananmen Square was attacked by an estimated 800 to 1,000 riot police. The police fired a couple of canisters of tear gas in an attempt to break up the crowd. The crowd responded by throwing rocks. The police responded to that by drawing their truncheons and clubbing people. The protest was not, however, broken up, and the march continued. And from my vantage point now, I can see many of the demonstrators. They have moved through the top end of Tiananmen Square and now appear to be going out of the square in another direction, away from the square. At the same time, a large group of soldiers, we don't have a precise number, perhaps a couple of thousand, some estimates put it as high as 5,000, have massed on a street behind the Great Hall of the People, just off Tiananmen Square. And as the crowd of demonstrators passed that street, there was a rather angry face-off between the demonstrators and the soldiers, with the demonstrators chanting and the soldiers looking angry and tense, chanting slogans back at the demonstrators. However, so far, this protest does not appear to have triggered any kind of wider violence. There are still thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people in Tiananmen Square. From my own vantage point, the number of security personnel visible is very, very small. And so, yet again, we have a situation where the authorities, in trying to enforce martial law and curb the activities of the demonstrators, have shown themselves to be largely ineffectual in carrying out that task. And the protest continues We have a large parade now of bicyclists who have massed in the center of the square, moving down away from the square towards the west, and in the square and on the other side of the square, large crowds remain.
Mike,
That's basically the situation. This happened barely 12 hours after a much larger push by the military to reach Tiananmen Square failed. In the wee hours of the morning, several thousand soldiers attempted to make it into the center of the square, but were repelled by large crowds of protesters, both students and ordinary citizens of Beijing. One Western diplomat with expertise in military affairs said that the move by the soldiers was one of the worst, badly planned, badly led, badly organized military exercises he had ever seen, and we're all speculating as to its real purpose and as to its consequences. In the meantime, the occupation of Tiananmen Square goes on.
Mike, if I may, it's just after, what, 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Tiananmen Square. This latest confrontation happened about an hour and a half ago, I believe, just after 2:30. Doesn't it seem likely that if this were an organized effort to remove the students, that something major would have happened already? This seems to be just a kind of a flare-up as opposed to an organized effort to get the students out.
It's hard to tell. It's very difficult to know what kind of instructions the authorities have had. Clearly, they are prepared to use much more force than they have been before, but all along they appear to have miscalculated the extent of security personnel they would need and the degree of force they would have to use to clear the square. So whether or not this was part of a concerted effort, or whether or not this was what the authorities thought would be a concerted effort, which proves to have been a major miscalculation, we simply don't know the answer to. The only thing that is clear is that it has not worked, and as was the case in the earlier attempt to enter the square some 12, 14 hours ago, appears likely to have the opposite effect of angering and inflaming the protesters, stiffening their resolve rather than encouraging them to leave Tiananmen Square.
Mike Chenoy, thank you very much. Mike Chenoy reporting live from Beijing. The pro-democracy movement is being supported largely by Chinese who are living away from their homeland. Many of them are sending money from a land where democracy has long been a way of life. CNN's Dave Monsees reports from New York.
Like anything in high demand, the financial cost of the democracy movement in China does not come cheap. $10,000 a day is the estimate by some organizers now to keep the protesters supplied with food, communication, and other support. Justin Yu is a New York-based reporter for a Chinese newspaper.
Imagine there's 1 million people once in Tiananmen Square. They need food. Where the money come from? Most of the money from overseas Chinese.
This $25,000 full-page ad in the New York Times was paid for by a group of Chinese-American professors at Princeton University.
A spontaneous response from all of us. A few people in Princeton, we talk about it immediately after we heard news about the student movement in China.
But money addressed to student protesters Beijing, China, would guarantee confiscation under Chinese martial law. For 40,000 Chinese studying in the U.S., the back-and-forth traveling provides one way of large numbers of people bringing in small amounts of money. This man sent money that way Thursday. Chen Jun holds American resident alien status and was expelled from China last month for protest activity. Now, he and other protest supporters are on the phone to Beijing daily, asking how much money is needed. Donations let him send $2,000.
We contact people which we knew in Beijing. They are all foreigners, to provide money. When the students provide a receipt, then we would send the money to those foreigners' accounts immediately.
In communities like New York's Chinatown, banks will send the money at the official exchange rate. But at storefronts where one employee has a desk, a fax machine, and a friend with a machine in Beijing, donations bring the black market rate of 3 to 4 times the official rate.
They have people's army. We have armies of people. They have control, and we have channels.
Various U.S. groups estimate $200,000 has been raised so far, and organizers say the money will continue as long as the protest and the struggle for democracy does. Dave Monsees, CNN, New York.
Let's update you again on the situation in Beijing. We have a still photo that we have just received from there. Perhaps we can see that as we do it. But apparently this latest confrontation began as a parade of students marched by some 300 to 400 Beijing police officers. There were some exchanges, and then 2 tear gas canisters were fired. And in the resulting melee that followed, it is reported that some Beijing police did truncheon or use nightsticks on some of the student demonstrators. But as you can see, the mass is huge in the Beijing, in the area of Beijing at this point in time. We'll update you as this story continues to develop, and we'll be right back. They fired tear gas into the crowd and beaten several people outside a nearby hotel. Witnesses say angry students responded by throwing rocks and bricks at police. CNN's Tom Montier joins us now on the phone live from Beijing. Tom, the latest?
Dave, the latest is the second confrontation between students and police or Army troops within the past 24 hours. This afternoon, Beijing time, it is now 4:30 in the afternoon here. A couple of hours ago, during a funeral march for 3 people who were killed during the first demonstration when the Army tried to move in, they were run over by a police truck, and the students decided to take their demonstration in support of those who were killed. What happened was about 700 or 800 riot police, fully decked out in helmets, fired several canisters of tear gas and attempted to break up the parade that was taking place. We have some late pictures in from the street, and you can see the riot police here locked arm in arm, stretching all the way across the street, and they were several deep. In the foreground of the picture, you see the student demonstrators who attempted to go at them face to face and evidently did not fare very well. But not all that much tear gas was in the square. This is an area just west of Tiananmen Square. The protest was moved away from the square in support of those who died early this morning, Beijing time, when the first confrontation between the Army troops and the students and residents of Beijing took place. A lot of troops were in the street, but the situation stands right now. They have moved back from the confrontation lines and are awaiting the next challenge either by the police or by the Army. Once again, the students are in the square, and this problem took place just west of the Tiananmen Square. There was an ambulance that came in and went out past the other side of the demonstration and through the square. We do not know who was in the ambulance, whether it was students or policemen injured in the melee that ensued after the tear gas was fired. But once again, the situation is stable now in Beijing, but the nerves are definitely at a tightrope end as they wait for the next confrontation between the students, the police, or the Army. This is Tom Montier, CNN, reporting live from Beijing.
Tom, as we look at this 2 hours since this latest confrontation began, it would appear as though this was rather spontaneous, that this was not something planned as a move into the square. You agree with that?
I would say that's probably true, because this occurred several blocks away from the square. It was when the student forces were not quite the numbers they have in the square, and it didn't appear to be a move on the square, rather a move on the parade.
Thank you very much. Tom Montier reporting live from Beijing. To discuss today's confrontation in Beijing is Richard Baum, professor of political science at UCLA. Professor Baum, thanks for joining us.
Bureau Chief Mike Chenoy is on the phone right now with the latest on a demonstration or a confrontation that is going on right now. Mike, what's the latest?
At the moment, another confrontation appears to be shaping up between protesters and the Chinese Army. According to an eyewitness, 7 truckloads of armed troops and 3 jeeps with soldiers are being confronted by a crowd of several thousand people on the second ring road, one of the main freeways that goes through Beijing. Apparently there was an incident in which one of the military jeeps hit a bicyclist and or a 3-wheeled bicycle, and we have reports that 3 or 4 people were injured and an angry crowd gathered. The troops are armed, but so far have not reportedly used those weapons, but it does indicate that there may be some additional movement of troops into the center of Beijing. There are rumors sweeping the city that sometime in the next 8 to 12 hours the Army will move in force to crush the protest. This may be an initial sign of that. We'll obviously have to wait and watch the situation as the evening develops here. That's the latest.
Mike, you say this was troops, and the earlier one, apparently there were troops as well as police. officers or police personnel involved in the earlier demonstration. Is there an actual difference?
Well, the impression we have is that the earlier clashes were actually two separate incidents, one involving police who emerged from the headquarters of the Chinese Communist Party and fired tear gas on a group of demonstrators passing by, which led to an ensuing exchange of rocks and bottles and so forth. The second, which is still going on at this moment, as best we can tell, several hundred soldiers in a road behind the Great Hall of the People are being confronted by a large crowd of protesters, the protesters haranguing the troops grimly hanging on. No serious violence there, but a tense standoff. The fear is that these kinds of confrontations could spread across Beijing. It's a very tense atmosphere. The people are very angry about what happened earlier in the day when troops tried to enter Tiananmen Square, and people are bracing themselves for what could be a bad night, although obviously we'll have to just wait and see how it develops.
Mike, set the scene in Tiananmen Square right now. How many protesters are there? How many Army troops or police personnel?
The situation in the square, there are tens of thousands of protesters in the square, and many more have sort of moved up into the direction of the west on the road which leads out of the square past the Great Hall of the People where these troops are. Apart from these troops, we see no other visible evidence of security personnel. But that is basically what the situation is. People here are now attempting to monitor the Chinese evening news to see what the government has to say about all of this.
Speaking of that, Mike, you're going to stay on the line. We also have an interpreter who is standing by, and we're going to take an excerpt right now of the Central China news program. This is their evening newscast. Let's listen in and see if they mention anything about these demonstrations. Again, Mike Chinoy is going to stay on the line as well as the voice of our interpreter.
Can I translate now?
Go ahead. Yes, thank you.
Okay. The citizens have already blocked the army from getting into the Beijing. And this creates anger of the army and the soldiers. Now we declare that nobody can stop the troops and the army. And nobody can interfere in the task that the army is carrying on the martial law. And the army and police have the right to crack down on the blockade of the citizens or anybody. Headquarters of the martial law troops. And the Beijing municipal government said that part of the martial law troops were blocked by the citizens early this morning. And soldiers behave themselves in a very disciplined way. And the soldiers were beaten or kidnapped by the people. Because of the blockade and traffic intersections, the traffic was jammed. And some people showed sympathy to the soldiers and they brought soldiers back home to provide them food and water. And the workers are trying to get rid of the blockade to get the traffic back to normal. And the troops now entering the city are carrying tasks of the government to carry on the martial law. And they are here not to aim at the citizens or students. And their actions have won the sympathy and understanding of the people. And the action of trying to block the soldiers away from the city is wrong. And this is the violation of the rules. And we should not believe in the rumors. And we should not spread the rumors. This morning, the National Defense Minister Qin Jiwei went to see the martial law troops. He represented Deng Xiaoping and Yang Shangkun to send best wishes to the soldiers. And the soldiers felt encouraged. He said, "You have won the sympathy and support from the citizens of Beijing for discipline and organized action. And you've shown that you are People's Army. And you can stand any test. You should carry on the martial law well." And this morning, the Industrial and Commerce Federation held a discussion participated by the entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs said that students are not the reason of riots, but the result of the demonstration is the industry and commerce were...
Again, what we're watching here is their evening newscast from Central China TV. As you can see, among other things, the news anchor person was saying, paraphrasing here, that the army and police have the right to break up the demonstrators in Tiananmen Square. Mike Chinoy, our Beijing bureau chief, is on the line with us, has been monitoring this newscast as well. Mike, following this story for many weeks as you have, do you see anything different in this newscast? And presumably this is the government statement, since the press is controlled there by the Chinese government. Do you see anything different in this newscast, any different words than we've seen in the past?
Yes, this newscast is extremely important for a couple of reasons. First of all, the anchor person was reading a series of messages from the Beijing martial law headquarters warning people not to go out in the streets, create obstacles, or in other ways obstruct the progression of the army into the city, also urging people not to listen to rumors, to keep calm. That would lend some additional backing to the reports that have been circulating that some kind of military move could be imminent. Equally, and perhaps even more significant, the television broadcast pictures of China's Minister of Defense, Qin Ji-wei, visiting the troops. That's extremely important. Qin Ji-wei is believed to be a close ally of Communist Party chief Zhao Ziyang. He is a moderate. He is said to have been skeptical of, if not outright openly opposed to, the imposition of martial law and the use of troops, and many people had reported that he was on the list of those who were going to be purged by the hardliners. And his reappearance suggests that at this time of extreme tension, some possible moves towards a compromise in the leadership struggle may be in the process of being worked out. In addition to Qin Ji-wei, another prominent military figure, Feng Xuezhi, was also mentioned. He has also been supposedly on the hit list of the hardliners. The precise nature of that compromise, obviously, is much too early to tell, but it may involve some sort of agreement under which the moderates drop their opposition to martial law and to the use of the army in return for the hardliners agreeing to abandon the use of deadly force, and perhaps once the square is cleared, to ease back on some of the harsher of the demands for communist orthodoxy and tightening of ideology and so on that the hardliners have been pushing. That is purely speculative, but it is very, very significant that the Minister of Defense, a man reportedly on his way out, has reappeared just at this very, very tense and critical juncture. We'll have to monitor this more carefully, but I think that's a very, very significant sign.
Mike, very quickly, what do you think the demonstrations, the confrontations today will mean? Will this rejuvenate the movement? Would you expect to see a lot more people getting into Tiananmen Square again? Are the demonstrations going to grow, do you think?
This is an ironic situation. What has been happening so far could simultaneously bolster both the hardliners and the protesters. The hardliners may be using the resistance to the army to argue for a tougher line if, in fact, that compromise has not been worked out or is running into problems. For the protesters, it has galvanized them, it has re-energized them, it has brought people back out onto the streets in a way we haven't seen in a while. So both sides are digging in, and unless the compromise that I was just speculating about turns into something that the leadership can present in a credible way to the public, if the troops do in fact move in, we could still have some serious trouble here, regardless of how the leadership struggle plays itself out over the coming hours and days.
Okay, Mike, some of the protesters tossed bricks and rocks back at the authorities. It was the first time since the demonstration began that violence has broken out. And just a few minutes ago, we saw China's evening newscast right here on CNN. The government-controlled newscast said security forces have the right to use force to impose martial law. And as CNN's Beijing Bureau Chief Mike Chinoy told us, there was a second, less violent confrontation between the authorities and the protesters. There are now an estimated 50,000 people in Tiananmen Square, but the crowd in the huge plaza has remained generally calm. Of course, these are videotaped pictures from that earlier demonstration, confrontation, following that confrontation. And of course, we will have the furthest details, the latest information from Beijing on this ongoing story throughout the day here on CNN. In other news, it may have seemed like a good idea at the time, but sales of a gun-shaped juice package are being discontinued.
In the next several hours. In the past couple of hours, the security forces have made several efforts to begin moving troops towards Tiananmen Square. The most recent reports are that 30 truckloads of armed troops were positioned at on a freeway crossover a couple of miles from the square in front of the Beijing1 diplomatic compound. That's where many foreign diplomats and journalists live. The troops were surrounded by a crowd that was rapidly growing in size. Further up the ring road where that initial confrontation is taking place, a similar confrontation between 7 truckloads of troops, 3 jeeps, and several thousand protesters was also taking place. So far, no violence reported at either of those. Reports from elsewhere in the city suggest that similar scenes are being played out at various other key intersections as people mobilize in the streets to block the entrance of troops into the square. In Tiananmen itself at this hour, a crowd of several thousand demonstrators is engaged in a standoff with a significant number of troops, perhaps a couple of thousand, on the back side of the Great Hall of the People, which fronts onto Tiananmen Square. That confrontation has been growing increasingly tense and ugly as the time passes, with some of the demonstrators now tearing up pieces of pavement and hurling these chunks of concrete at the soldiers. The demonstrators also breaking the limbs off of trees nearby and sharpening them to some kind of weapon. So far, no strong response from the soldiers, but that situation continues to become increasingly ugly. All this follows an afternoon here in Beijing. It's now 8 in the evening, of violent confrontation at a couple of different places in the city center. Soldiers have been facing off, as I said, outside the Great Hall of the People all afternoon. At the same time, about 1,500 police tear-gassed and beat a crowd of protesters outside the headquarters of the Chinese Communist Party at a place called Zhongnanhai, about half a mile from Tiananmen Square. It was the first time the security forces have used tear gas and clubs in that way, and that was the clearest indication so far that the patience of the authorities appears to be running out, and that they have allowed the soldiers and police greater latitude to adopt harsher measures to try and curb this situation. All of this came after an extraordinary night in which several thousand soldiers attempted unsuccessfully to enter Tiananmen Square. That operation remains a source of some puzzlement to those of us following it because of the way in which it was carried out, in which many of these soldiers, without heavy weapons, not wearing their normal uniforms, moved on foot towards the square, but they too were blocked by large crowds of citizens and students and turned away in what can only be described as a humiliating retreat and a humiliating failure. So that is the situation now. The other interesting development in the past hour has come on the national evening news on Chinese television. That news is usually a good barometer of the way the political winds are blowing, and it showed first a series of messages from the Beijing Martial Law Command warning people to be calm, stay off the streets, and not set up roadblocks and barricades. And then it showed pictures of the defense minister of China, Qin Ji-wei. This was very significant. He is considered to be a liberal and an ally of the embattled Communist Party chief Zhao Ziyang. Many people had predicted that he would be purged as part of the shakeout of moderate figures in the senior leadership. His reappearance suggests that the moderates and the hardliners, in the face of the continuing unrest, may be trying to hammer out some sort of compromise in which both sides agree on the need to clear the streets and restore order, but in return for that, the scale of the purge and the scale of the crackdown and the scale of the retrenchment being advocated by the hardliners may be minimized somewhat. That, I must stress, is pure speculation, but analysts here who follow Chinese politics see no other reasonable explanation for the reappearance of the defense minister. So there's clearly some movement and activity within the power struggle, and there's lots of activity on the streets with everyone here in the capital expecting more to come as the light fades and we move into Saturday night and early Sunday morning in Beijing.
Mike, as you well know, as we watched and listened through the voice of an interpreter that evening newscast, it certainly seemed extraordinary that the government, through its messages, through the anchor person, was trying to somehow legitimize the fact that it does have the right under martial law to break up the demonstration. Is that not an extraordinary statement from the government?
Well, it's clear all along that the government has felt it has that right. Those statements appear to me to be designed both to urge the public to stay off the streets and to alert the public to the likelihood that troops in significant numbers might be on the streets tonight, to warn people who resisted the troops that that was not a wise thing to do, and that the troops had the right to do whatever was necessary to handle such a situation. It was clearly a pretty tough approach, and it would be consistent with the reports sweeping the city that some kind of major military push may be in the offing. So far, however, we do not see any large numbers of troops moving into the square beyond those who are already there. However, as word of the military activity elsewhere has spread around town, crowds have been gathering at the main intersections leading into Tiananmen Square. At one intersection, a crowd of several hundred people has surrounded a solitary military or police jeep and have been harassing the people inside. They, in fact, got their caps off the people who were wearing them and have been throwing them around outside on the jeep. So people are clearly bracing themselves, but we have not yet seen the push into the square in the kind of numbers or with the kind of force that most of us watching this situation think would be necessary to dislodge the protesters. That could well come, though.
Mike, do you think that the military commanders are having a tough time convincing their troops that these students that have been demonstrating for weeks now in Tiananmen Square and elsewhere, that they are actually counter-revolutionaries as the government has tried to portray them, or that they're just, students that are upset and want more democracy? I mean, in other words, if the command was given in the worst-case scenario to take the square by force, do you think that the military commanders have their troops in line where they would actually do that and move on the students?
The Chinese army is a pretty well-trained army, and I suspect if push came to shove, the soldiers, most of them anyway, would reluctantly follow orders. But we do have this extraordinary phenomenon that at each point where soldiers have attempted some kind of move, they have been met by these enormous crowds of civilians who have been both physically blocking their way and arguing with them, berating them, lecturing them. Most of these soldiers are kids from the countryside. They've hardly ever been in a city. They have no understanding of the complexities or the sophistication of the political battles being waged here. They're given very simple instructions, such as, you are going to restore order in our capital, Beijing. And the Chinese army takes its motto of being a people's army very, very seriously. And so when these young recruits are brought into this kind of situation, and suddenly, instead of finding bad guys beating and smashing and looting, or foreigners desecrating Chinese soil, they find ordinary Chinese people by the tens of thousands not being actively hostile to them, but beseeching them not to turn their weapons on the populace, not to use their military might against the protesters. It's a very troubling and upsetting experience. experience. And in fact, many of these young soldiers have been seen to break down and cry after extended encounters with the protesters in the streets. So clearly it must have some effect on the morale of the rank and file, and also there's no question that the evidence is very clear at the higher levels that many commanders and very senior military officials, including that defense minister we just saw on Chinese television, have reservations about seeing the Army used in this way. But I suspect if the order came in a very clear-cut manner, the troops would probably push through, but at great cost both in the short term and also to the Army's own morale and internal cohesiveness in the longer term.
Mike, very quickly, just set the stage for us in Tiananmen Square. Troops surround it. The student demonstrators are inside this military cordon, if you will. Is that the situation right now?
The situation in Tiananmen Square, as you can hear, there are sirens blaring as various ambulances make their way. I'll put the phone out so you can hear that. In the square itself, tens of thousands of people remain. On the far side of the square, over by the Great Hall of the People, a group of soldiers is surrounded by a crowd, some of whom are throwing rocks at them, many others of whom are arguing with them. In all of this, a fair amount of normal traffic is attempting to make its way along the main boulevard into and out of the square, people on bicycles and cars and so on. But clearly the mood is growing more tense as the evening comes on and as it gets darker, with the concern that in the wee hours of the morning, or perhaps sooner, we could see some kind of concerted push by the military.
Okay, Mike Chinoy, CNN's Beijing bureau chief, with the latest developments in Tiananmen Square and elsewhere around the Chinese capital. Of course, he will be there, and we will have further details throughout the day and throughout the weekend here on CNN for the very latest developments. You know, since the uprising began in China 7 weeks ago, the United States has urged the communist government not to use force against the demonstrators. That call was issued once again on Friday.